and welcome again to another class. This is session 3 of our course in social psychology. In our first session, we said social psychology is a science. In the second, I introduced you to some of the methods of conducting scientific research in social psychology. In this third session, we are going to continue on our discussion of methods. And we are going to look at two main methods that are used in social psychology: the experimental method and the correlational method. So that at the end of the session, my expectation is that you would know what each of these methods really involves and be able to differentiate between the two methods and know what their pluses and minuses are. So in this session, we are going to look at the correlation method. We are going to look at the calculation and the interpretation of the correlation coefficient and look at the advantages and disadvantages of the methods. Then we look at the experimental method, what conditions you need to put in place to make an experiment successful, look at some types of experiments, and look at the limitations of the experimental method. Here again, the expectation is that you read the first chapter of the recommended text and the article on this session posted on Sakai. So to start off, the correlation method, what is it? This is another method where you systematically observe two or more variables, two or more social phenomena, to see if they happen together, to see whether if a change happens in one phenomenon, a change necessarily happens in the other, right? So it does not involve randomly assigning people. It does not involve any manipulation. You are looking at two naturally occurring variables to see whether when this happens, does that also happen? If this changes, does that also change? So you are looking at two naturally occurring variables. You do not manipulate any variable to see if they occur together or are associated. For example, are political insults related to political violence? Would people act violent when they are insulted? Would there be violence when there are electoral malpractices? Would there be school dropouts when there is teenage pregnancy? When people become pregnant, do they drop out of school? Do these things happen naturally? When people are anxious, will they seek out others? Does anxiety lead to affiliation? Right? So you are looking at things that are happening naturally, not things that you are causing. They happen naturally, and you see what are the behaviors that are associated. The only way you can know if behavior or phenomena are associated is by calculating what we call the correlation coefficient. As a sociologist, it would be good to be able to calculate your own coefficient. But if you are not able to calculate it, you may be helped by a statistician. What is critical for you to know is how to interpret the information that is given you. So if you've studied, say, teenage pregnancy and school dropout, you calculate a correlation coefficient to see if these two phenomena are related. The result you get from your coefficient would by all means fall within the range of -1 and 1. So if after the calculation you get the figure 0, it just tells you that the two variables are in no way related. There is no correlation, for instance, between school dropout and teenage pregnancy if you get the figure 0. If you get the figure 1, +1, it tells you, yes, the two variables are related. If you get -1 or any figure in the negatives, it tells you again that, yes, the variables are related, but in a negative direction. So simply, the correlation method does two key things. It tells you whether phenomena are related and it also tells you the direction of the relationship. Let me take a moment to explain this. Are they related? If you get 0, it means they are not related. If you get 1 or 0.5 or anything in the positives, it tells you, yes, they are related in a positive direction. What it means is that as teenage pregnancy increases, school dropout increases. As variable A increases, variable B increases. Related in a positive direction. In a negative direction is when you get -1 or any figure in the negatives. It tells you again that yes, the variables are related, but in a negative direction. As one variable increases, the other decreases. They are not going in the same direction. As one increases, the other decreases. So as school dropout increases, teenage pregnancy decreases. And it doesn't matter if the relationship doesn't make sense to you. It is not your duty as a researcher to manipulate anything. You report what you have seen. So to be able to determine if variables are correlated, it is critical that you calculate the correlation coefficient. What are the strengths of the correlation method? You say it's a very practical method used to study real-life situations. So you are not deliberately going to get girls pregnant to see if they will drop out of school. If it happens in real terms, then you measure, right? Behaviors that cannot be created in laboratory settings can best be studied using the correlation method. You cannot create civil war or create a flood or create an earthquake just to see how people would behave, right? So it takes you away from the challenges of ethical issues. You do not engender any ethical issues. We say it's a very efficient method because it helps you to obtain a large amount of data in a relatively short time. Note our definition. We said it's where 2 or more variables are studied. So for instance, you want to study the relationship between poverty and crime. In the correlational research, you can look at the relationship between poverty, crime, teenage pregnancy, unemployment, several variables in one research. That is what we call the regression analysis. This you can read about in the text, in the mandatory text. So correlation is very useful in studying real-life situations. It gives you a lot of data in a short time. You don't need to manipulate anything to engender ethical challenges. The disadvantage or the challenge with the correlation method is that it cannot infer causation. It cannot tell you that the variable A caused variable B. It cannot determine a cause-effect relationship. It can only tell you the variables are related, but it cannot tell you which caused what. Then again, we have the reverse causality problem. Sometimes variable A or variable B can interchange. Variable A, which is an independent variable, could well become a dependent variable. What do I mean by all of this? Take the relationship between school dropout and teenage pregnancy. You are saying that when a child gets pregnant, she is likely to drop out of school. It makes sense, doesn't it? But again, it also makes sense to say that when a girl drops out of school, she's likely to get pregnant. So when you interchange the variables, they both make sense. So which then is the dependent and the independent variable? That is what you must be conscious of as a researcher. Poverty leads to crime. It makes sense, doesn't it? Crime leads to poverty. That also makes sense. So which of these is the independent and the dependent variable? That is what we call the reverse causality problem, which you must know about and be conscious of so that you do not fall into that challenge. So I've just provided a few examples. Try to determine which of them is the dependent variable, which is the independent variable, and see if there is any correlation between them. Teenage pregnancy, school dropout, poverty, and corruption. Are they correlated in any way? Then we talk of the experimental research. What is this? How is it done? How do we interpret findings? With experiments, we manipulate. You take one phenomenon and manipulate it to see if it will result in a change in another phenomenon. So we say it is a method of research in which one or more variables are systematically altered or changed. Altered or changed meaning manipulating it to see if it will generate an effect in another variable. So basically with this kind of method, we have a clear goal in mind, right? And we want to be able to determine cause and effect. That is why we manipulate. There are two conditions that are critical if your experiment will be successful, right? And to understand these conditions, let's first understand the dependent and independent variable. I am talking about manipulation. Which variable do you manipulate? You manipulate what we call the independent variables. And the behavior you observe to see if any change has happened in is what is called the dependent variable. So for instance, you want to see if alcohol intake leads to violent behavior. Which of these are you going to manipulate? The intake of alcohol. That is your independent variable. So you get participants, some of which you would give, say, a tot of alcohol. Another, you give 2 tots of alcohol. Another group, you give 3 tots of alcohol. See, you are manipulating the quantity of alcohol intake. And if you observe any change in aggressive behavior with every increase in alcohol intake, then you can say that it is this that is causing that. So the violent behavior becomes your dependent variable. That's the behavior you're observing. And the one you manipulate is your independent variable. I hope this is very clear, because you need to understand this to be able to conduct an experiment. We say that the subjects you use in an experiment must be randomly assigned. Pick them randomly, right? So that everybody has an equal chance of being included in the experiment. Then your findings can be generalized. Your findings can be authentic. So basically what we are saying is that if you are looking at alcohol intake and violent behavior, get people from all backgrounds, men, women, young, old, all backgrounds, educated, non-educated. So it doesn't appear that it's because they are all men, that's why they acted violently. You should have some women in there, randomly select people into the experimental group. Besides the experimental group, we also have the control group. That is the group you do not touch, you do not manipulate. So in this example, the control group would not take any alcohol. Then you see how they behave. The experimental group is a group that you manipulate to see how they behave. The second condition, if your experiment is going to be successful, is to hold all extraneous variables constant. What do we mean by this? Simply what this means is that after you have randomly selected your participants, be sure that whatever behavior you are observing is as a result of what you are manipulating and not some extraneous variable interfering with the experiment. What does all of this mean? If you want to see whether alcohol intake causes violent behavior, then you should be certain in your mind that your participants are only acting under the influence of alcohol, and that these participants did not come into the experiment having already taken some medication that predisposes them to violent behavior, or having not taken some other substance that may predispose them to violent behavior. So, or even if they have not already taken in some alcohol already, imagine you doing an experiment and saying, I'm going to give 300 ml of alcohol, but the participant had already come in having already taken 200 ml. That person has excess alcohol in the system already. And so that 200 he took before coming in is an extraneous variable interfering with the process. So what all of these means is that in order for your experiment not to be confounded, ensure that nothing else is interfering with the variable that you are manipulating. That is the ideal goal, even though you cannot achieve it in a 100% situation. That is what you should work towards as a researcher. Randomly pick your participants and keep extraneous variables at bay. There are various types of experiments. We have the laboratory experiments, where you bring participants into a lab setting, a laboratory setting, manipulate them to get your result. So this classroom can become a lab setting. So I can have a group of students in here, and I can manipulate the temperature in this room, where I can make the room extremely cold or extremely hot, right? Just to see how students react to the changes in temperature. And as I do that, I observe the changes. This is a laboratory setting. The good thing about the lab setting is that such experiments are relatively cheaper compared to field experiments. They are relatively much more accurate because it is a controlled environment and you can manipulate the situation. And such researches can easily be replicated or repeated. That is the advantage of having experiments in the lab setting. Then you can also do your experiments in a field setting, where you go out there into the real life setting, everyday settings, and try to manipulate people to observe their behavior. So for instance, you go into the mall and you observe somebody pick items off the shelf into their basket. And as they pick the items, you pick it out. As they put it in the basket, you take it and drop it out, just to see their response. And you perhaps are with another researcher who observes and records how with every annoyance picking of their things out of their baskets, they respond and record. So these are done in the field. The advantage is that people cannot pretend. You catch them in their real settings. The disadvantage is that extraneous variables may interfere with such a setting. You are not able to control their infiltration. It becomes difficult then to establish cause-effect relationships. Then sometimes it becomes a challenge in getting access to the experiment. Imagine you want to do a research in the prison. Sometimes getting access to certain settings, natural settings, can become a challenge. And you cannot really create a prison setting, no matter how well you try. It may not be an exact replication of what a prison actually is. So this session basically has sought to look at two main methods in social psychology. If you read the mandatory text, most of the findings are based on these methods, particularly experiments. So we say that yes, these methods are used. Correlation looks at relationships. Are variables, are behaviors related? And what is the strength? What is the magnitude of the relationship? Then with experimentation, we want to establish causality. Does this cause this? That provocation cause annoyance? Does A cause B? That's the main difference between the two methods. One establishes causality, the other does not. I would encourage you to read the literature to know the various things you can study using either of these methods. And this is the final session on our methods. So in sum, we are saying that as a social psychologist, you can use the correlation method, the experimental method, the survey, the archival method, the ethnographic method, and the observation method, depending on what it is or what behavior you are seeking to understand. Thank you.